The Able to Care podcast is sponsored by Able Training Support Limited, who build partnerships with organisations to develop confidence and competence in their team to promote positive outcomes for all. Find the link in the description. Hello and welcome to Able to Care podcast. My name is Andy Baker. And on today's episode, we're going to be talking about a principle that's called Room 1, Room 2. So I'm going to give full credit to a lady called Sarah Naish regarding this particular principle. I came across it within one of her books, and I've used it at a number of different environments or a number of different ways because I think it's really impactful to understand. For those of you out there, most likely this will affect individuals who are looking after others who've come from difficult backgrounds, okay? Or unaccompanied asylum-seeking children or whatever it is. So foster parents or professional caregivers of those with mental health conditions, learning disabilities, etc. Okay, so let me just explain the Room 1, Room 2 principle, and I'll kind of expand on how I feel it applies and how I think it helps people to improve their empathy and improve their understanding around some of the things that they might find difficult. The Room 1, Room 2 premise. So I use this as a teaching activity, and essentially I get all of the people in the room to maybe choose a particular person that they work with, or it might be to generalize. But what kind of experiences might this individual had? And Room 1 represents where they came from. So it's where they used to live. It's the home that they were raised in, or it was the background they've come from. It could even been the previous home or care home, for instance, that they came from. Okay. So Room 1 looks at what kind of experiences might they have had within that setting? So how are they spoken to? How are they treated? What they might have been witness to? All the kind of the values and the experiences they may have undertaken. And obviously there is generalizations. So one could be, if they have come from abusive or neglectful backgrounds with lower social economic kind of resources, then it could have been, food was limited, or food was more junk foods than balanced diet. It could have been there was a lack of, there was more violence or exposure to drugs and alcohol or sex, or they could have been shouted at or criticized or teased, or obviously the list could go on, kind of looking at all of these different areas this person might have found was their day-to-day. So Room 1 is where we look at what this person's come from, okay? Then what I get them to do is then do Room 2, and Room 2 is whichever the setting is, what we're now trying to offer. And usually that's, nurturing, caring, routine, boundaries, fun, play, balanced diets, positive interactions, positive relationships. The list kind of goes on as far as all of these positive aspects. So we have this big list of Room 1, which is where they've come from, and Room 2, which is what we're now trying to provide. And I basically then invite the group to just explain which of those two rooms they'd rather live in or rather be in. And obviously the majority is a case of, well, of course, Room 2. Room 2 looks an awful lot nicer. It's a much better environment to be in. But then I get them to look at it like this. To imagine that you got abducted off the street tomorrow, bag over your head, shoved in the back of a van, and taken to a place that you had no choice over whether you went there or not. And everything about this place was different. The culture was different. The language was different. People spoke to you differently. There was different rules. There was different etiquette. There was different food. There was different music. There was different values, beliefs, everything. Everything about this place seemed different. Now, how would you initially feel in this foreign land? And I think most of us would probably admit that we'd feel overwhelmed, we'd feel challenged, we'd feel upset, we'd feel nervous, unsettled. And I don't think many of us would immediately then go, so I must adapt. Maybe some would more than others. And I think that's a very realistic kind of thing that some people do. But most of us wouldn't just throw ourselves into it. especially as we didn't choose to go there, or we'd only throw ourselves into it as a kind of a survival mechanism, that maybe I need to pretend to act like these people do to be safe because I don't know whether they're okay or not yet. Okay, and that's quite meaningful and definitely worthwhile considering as we're moving forwards. But I think the point I'm trying to get over is that within this, what felt like comfortable, I got taken away from and thrown into this other land. I always use a kind of joke that most people tend to take their own tea bags when they go on holiday. They go into this beautiful other country, but they take just that little bit of home with them. So very few of us immediately immerse ourselves in this new place. We're probably going to kind of shout in our own language rather than learning theirs. We're going to try and make whatever space we find feel as familiar and uncomfortable and as comfortable as we possibly can to make it feel like home. Okay, and I think that's perfectly normal. Would we feel grateful for being in room 2? Well, it's highly unlikely, even if other people were telling us, but this is going to be better for you. This is going to be easier. This is going to have a better quality of life. This is going to be nicer for you. Okay. Initially, it's going to feel overwhelming. It's going to feel foreign. It's going to feel something that you can't trust. And I think one thing that's really important is that I'm definitely not going to feel grateful when I'm teaching this around foster parent environments and things like that, or children's homes and children's residential homes. I sometimes get this put across because, why would the child want their bedroom untidy? Because that's maybe the only place in the world that they get to call their own to some degree or another. And maybe untidy is what they're used to. Maybe untidy and dirty is for them normal. And they survived however many years within this particular setting. And then you're telling them, well, this is wrong now. You shouldn't do it this way. This isn't the best thing for you. Well, why would I trust you? Why would I immediately change my ways? I'm going to want to, feel comfortable. The individual is going to try and go into room 2 and or go into room 1 and pull staff or carers from room 2 into room 1. Come and shout at me because that feels like home. Criticize me because that feels like home. Ignore me because that feels like home. And home is still where the heart is. And I think that's quite impactful, especially working with, children who've come from different backgrounds that, going, this is better for you, but why would I trust that? And they'll initially try and do anything they can to make it feel familiar, make it feel normal. Well, some will. Some will obviously fall into the trap of if I just behave how I think they want me to behave, then hopefully I'll survive this. And this, for many of you, is what we refer to as the honeymoon period, which could last 3 weeks, 3 months, a year, whatever it is. And it doesn't mean they're okay. They're masking, they're protecting. And actually can be a really positive sign when they then start to kind of be themselves a little bit more, if you like, start to say no and be defiant, because at least they're feeling confident enough safe enough to be able to do that. I know that isn't always how it feels. Now, obviously, I've given you a specific example there around the kind of the foster care world, but I think we could map that principle over. So, with any care setting, if you're working with an individual who has come from a more institutionalized environment or always lived with parents where maybe they've been kind of protected and things like that, they then step into this care world where suddenly they're encouraged to be independent. It doesn't mean they're lazy when they're not. It may just be, but this isn't what I do. This isn't how I live. And why you're telling me that this is going to be better for me, but why would I trust that when I've been doing it the other way for years? It's always trying to get over that change takes time. If we're looking for a person to change their behavior or change their, change behavior for the better, for their best interest for them, then that's where we're trying to help them to see the benefit of the change. We're not going to force them to change. So I use the example with the untidy bedroom that, especially within a trauma recovery model, one of my preferred trauma recovery models is referred to as stabilization, then metabolization, which is a fancy word, and don't ask me to spell it, integration, and then adaptation. And the basic premise is, initially, let's help this person to feel as safe as possible. So a good analogy for this actually is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Some of you will be familiar with Maslow's hierarchy, that we have these basic needs like food and water, then we have safety and security, and then we have, what's next on there? Then it's relationships and attachments, then it's self-esteem, and then it's reaching our full potential. That's simplified it in a nutshell. So how am I going to start building self-esteem and doing really well at school if I don't even know whether I'm going to get fed tomorrow, or whether I can trust these people that are here? Or let's say that I'm an adult stepping into this care world. Are they going to know my routine? Are they going to know how I like things? Especially working those with those on the autistic spectrum. You're a new person. You're unpredictable. And suddenly stepping into this new world, are you going to know how to care for me? Incredibly scary experience when you rely on others to potentially navigate your world. Now, I'm then going to look at this in a slightly different way, maybe, that will apply to some of the others out there. Let's say we've got an individual who world has changed in a different way, that their room one was where they were independent and they were self-sufficient and they were in control of or managed multiple people, for instance. They ran a household, whatever it is. And then due to something like an acquired brain injury, a traumatic brain injury, or a degenerative brain disease, a dementia, this person is then losing some of those skills and abilities, or they're now having to be looked after in a different place. I think it's so important to kind of understand that, well, you need this because it's going to be better for you, but it's still a case of, but it's not my room one, and that is still what feels comfortable and what feels like home. And I think recognizing that, I think within acquired brain injury, I do an exercise when we talk about, it's called I feel mad, I feel bad, I feel sad. And we read out these different scenarios of what might happen after an acquired brain injury, for instance. And we get people to think about, would that make you feel mad or bad, like a bad person, or sad? If you're struggling to regulate your temper and lashing out at people, it might make you feel like you're a bad person now. Or it might make you feel like you're going crazy because you can't control this emotion or this behaviors as you once did, and you're acting out in ways that you know are wrong, but you can't inhibit in that moment. And I think it's really impactful that, again, that understanding that the room one is still where they want to be, and the loss of self-esteem from that. So if you think about, I think Maslow's hierarchy is, it's such a genius concept in some ways, and it's probably the most well-known psychological theory out there. But people don't always realize that isn't a fixed movement towards self-actualization. We're not always going up. It was Carl Rogers, I believe, that postulated we're constantly moving up and down throughout that hierarchy. And I'm sure many of you out there can relate to this. I know I went through a period in my life where I felt very self-actualized, but then I went through a major relationship breakdown, and not only did I then lose my self-actualization, my full potential, but I lost all my self-esteem as well, because I'd gone down in those levels, and I had to kind of rebuild those back up again to get up to that self-actualization side of things. I had to find that kind of connection and attachment and stuff like that from other resources, whether from myself or from others. And I think that's really worthwhile, that, something happens, boom, straight back down, and I've got to rebuild from there. And it can take a long time to do. I mentioned this to somebody who's coming on a guest here soon. I won't give away who it is as yet. But I spoke to this lady about this very scenario because of the environment that she'd come from. She'd never heard this room one, room two. She was aware of it, very much aware of it, that there's things that she was exposed to when she was younger, that then as she got older, the red flags that usually were there weren't there. She didn't pick up on them as dangers because they felt like home. They felt normal. They felt familiar. They felt like, well, I survived in that for the first however many years of my life, so how can that be wrong? And I think it was a really interesting perspective, or way of putting it, at least, that she hadn't heard before. So again, I'll give a bit of a kudos there to Sarah Naish. Check out her books as far as therapeutic parenting is concerned. And I'm sure we'll do a podcast on therapeutic parenting at some point or another, or talk about it in more detail, as it is one of the principles that I kind of underpin a lot of my behavioral management stuff from. So yeah, we'll talk about that another time. But yeah, hopefully you found that interesting. Obviously, if anything on this podcast you found interesting or useful, please make sure you like, follow, subscribe, or share, pass on to others, and I'll see you next time.